Good morning, Annie, and thank you for having me as part of the event today. Yeah, my role at MTN, it is very large. Effectively, I need to ensure that our customers are safe and secure in operating with MTN, and that covers all of our countries of operation and all of our platform business as well. So we operate across around 18 markets across Africa, and have fintech businesses and digital businesses kind of tied into that as well. So all aspects of that ultimately are important to myself.
Okay, so rather you than me. Let's just come back a little bit now to look at mobile signaling. And this is something that always surprises me because it's such a fundamental element of the global telecoms ecosystem. It's, you know, fundamental to one phone being able to talk to another no matter where. And yet the interconnection hubs are very attractive targets for cyber criminals and also for state-sponsored surveillance, which is becoming increasingly frightening, really, possibly. And I'm just wondering what we're doing to defend them and what role AI might play. So let's start with the fact that this is like this is a standard part of the network, if you like, a critical part. And it sounds like it would be a commonplace technical function to cover these functionalities, because vulnerabilities, if they're exploited, can have a huge human impact. So could you just talk a little bit about that? Set the scene for us a little bit.
Sure. So most of the calls, or a fair number of the calls that we make or the communication that we do, are to people who potentially sit on other people's networks. So we're not all sitting on the same network. So these networks have to be able to talk with each other. And the protocols that are used to do this have been around kind of since the inception of the GMS networks. So if one goes back 20 or 30 years in history, security wasn't such a big thing back then. So when these protocols were being designed, security wasn't baked in from the start. So it's been pointed out over the years on a fairly regular basis, I think starting since about 2008, that there are fundamental flaws within these protocols that can be abused by bad actors to do all sorts of things that, as a customer of the cell phone network, you wouldn't want those things happening. Now, these protocols are then tied to the different network protocols. So while we talk 5G and 6G and beyond, the reality is that we still have a lot of 2G, 3G networks deployed all around the world. And those 2G and 3G networks use the SS7 protocol, 4G uses the diameter protocol, and then 5G has newer ways of doing things. But while we have these old networks in place, we sit with these design flaws in these protocols that are getting abused by syndicates and by all sorts of different people. So the kinds of attacks that we're talking about here are things like SMS interception. Now, we know SMS is often used for two-factor authentication. So an SMS interception could result in two-factor bypass, account takeover, all sorts of things like that. There's also denial of service attacks, and there's also things like location tracking. Now, location is pretty important. We have people like journalists and the like who don't necessarily want their location known to parties who might have a vendetta against them. And there have been reported instances of quite dire consequences to people where their location has been compromised. There was a fairly widely reported example of a Mexican journalist who was shot outside his house, and his phone had been pinged for location the day before he was killed. So that's of significant concern to anybody who's using a mobile device and needs their privacy respected.
Okay, so we're talking about potential assassinations and thieving lots of money because the two-factor authentication, well, there are instances when that's been hacked, certainly. So this is quite potentially scary stuff, but I suspect most of it is more commonplace, but not boring if you're the victim.
For sure.
Horrendous if you're the victim. Okay. So at the end of 2021, and I am mindful that's 3 years ago and quite a lot's happened since then, but a UK market intelligence firm, Mobile Squared, estimated that only 25% of mobile operators had put a firewall in place to prevent illegal geolocation surveillance. How much do you think the situation has improved since then?
It's difficult to have accurate numbers, but I guess the incidental information we get from our monitoring platforms is that it would have improved a little bit, but not as much as we would like. So as MTN, we have firewalls in place to manage this. So we block inbound attacks against our customers. And we monitor those at the same time to see where they're originating from, which networks, which countries, which regions. And we haven't seen a significant decline in those attacks. And one would expect that as more and more firewalls get deployed across different operators, they would be blocking both inbound and outbound attacks. So you would expect those attacks to decline. And that certainly hasn't been the case. But there are a large number of different players in this ecosystem. So, we have 195 countries, more than 750 different operators. And beyond the operators, they also sometimes allow other parties to use their network to transmit some of this information. So it's a very broad ecosystem that's not completely transparent in terms of how it works and who's been allocated which of the global titles or GTs within this infrastructure. So this lack of transparency can make it very difficult to manage this whole environment.
So it's not only that there are a huge number of players involved, but also you can't necessarily see who's doing what.
No. So normally you can identify the primary telco who's involved, but if they've then leased some of their GTs
but that
to a
it might
third
not be
party,
them. Yeah.
no, it might not be them. And then you can have further subleasing happening. So they might lease it to somebody, that party then leases it to another one. So you have less and less transparency as this goes down. And then the whole system of GTs, it's also kind of managed country by country, and even within a country, it may not be managed very effectively. So there's almost a self-declaration saying, okay, I will be using this set of GTs. And there's nobody that you can actually confirm that with to say, yes, this telco actually is using this. So you could have an example of, let's say, a telco going bankrupt or being taken over or moving to a new set of GTs, and somebody just picks up their old ones and carries on using them. And because there's no central registry or anything like that that's effective in this space, those will just carry on working.
And
So
why is it so difficult? Because why does it make it life so difficult? Because you've no transparency of who the actors are. Does that mean you've less transparency about what they're up to?
well, we can, through the firewalls and technology that's deployed, and as you said earlier, not everybody's deployed this. We can see the messages that are coming through. We can see the malformed messages, and we can see the attacks that are happening, and we can then block them. Now, we can't then necessarily see what the end goal of that might be. So somebody might ping the network to see, are you going to block it? Are you going to allow it? If you block it, they may not continue. So yeah, it's quite difficult at times to see exactly what they're up to. And they purposely make it difficult to track them down. So you'll find an attacker won't just attack from one location or one GT. They might have access to tens or hundreds of these that they've subleased in different locations. And then they'll attack you from a range of these to see whether the results are different across any of these. And then if they're not successful on SS7, they might then move over to diameter and carry on with the attack and see if they can be successful in that place.
So it's quite tricky to establish a pattern of one player or one actor, because it looks like there are a lot of individual things happening.
Absolutely. And this is a problem that's known, that the GSMA has been very aware of and has been trying to do something about. So just over a year ago, they released their global title leasing code of conduct, trying to put some measures in place around it. So there's hope that that will help with some of these problems. Again, the challenge is that the telcos are by and large members of the GSMA, but their primary lease partners may not be members of the GSMA, and then the subleases of those certainly won't be members. So you're going to have to try and enforce this primarily to the telcos, and then try and get them through their contracting with their partners to then disallow some of this bad behavior. So it's going to be a long process, but at least a start has been made. That always helps.
Okay, well, usually we take questions at the end, but a question's just popped up from the audience asking about the take-up of this code of conduct. And have you got any comments on that? I mean, are we seeing generally it's the larger operator groups who are behind this, but actually maybe arguably it's the smaller operator groups who are causing the problems, or is that a grossly unfair statement?
It's probably a reasonably fair statement in that I think it's the larger groups who've invested in the technology to be able to see what's going on. So they are the ones who can see the incoming attacks, and at the same time then will be blocking any kind of outgoing attacks from their networks or infrastructure. The smaller ones probably don't have that in place and see it as a revenue opportunity by doing this leasing. So are probably more focused on the revenue than on the impact on the ecosystem. So it's a reasonable statement. I think in terms of the take-up, my understanding is that so far it's relatively slow, but what it is doing is raising a lot of conversations. So people are talking about in all sorts of different forums, which I think is really helpful for the longer term. So I think we will see momentum go behind this, and it's also resulting in a lot more exposure of the attacks that are happening and sharing of information around the attacks. So as more and more information is shared, more people are interested then in saying, okay, well, what's happening on my network? And so you build a kind of groundswell of activity around this. So I see all of that as being positive, although it would be better if there was a little bit more speed and momentum to this thing.
Yes. I think you said the magic words in the middle of all that, which are revenue opportunities, which to a lot of operators right now are really the magic words. So we've got this GSMA Global Title Leasing Code of Conduct, but at the moment, one of the issues that, as far as I can see, is that third-party network leasing by mobile operators is not regulated and it's not transparent. So what are we trying to do about that as an industry?
Yes, so I think that's exactly what this code of conduct is trying to address. In that, if one goes into the detail of the code of conduct, it's looking at saying, okay, for anybody who signs up to the code of conduct, there's a whole lot of different elements that you need to comply with, and that includes making sure that there is transparency. So if you're going to do some subleasing, you have to then make it known explicitly in terms of publishing, okay, who is the third party that's using that lease that you're giving to them. So it can't just hide behind what the mobile operator is doing and saying, well, it's subleased and we don't know what's going on there. The second piece of it is also trying to make the telcos then responsible for the traffic that flows through those GTs. Because at the moment, you can give a third party access to the global title, and they can then do what they like in terms of the traffic that goes through that title. So their traffic actually won't flow through your network. And there's views around saying, well, we need to change that to make the telco actually responsible for all of that traffic and at least push that traffic directly through the telco network, and don't let these lessees just pump their traffic directly onto this global network. And that would also help around this. But until everybody's signed up for this, you're not going to get to where you need to be.
And what about the GSMA's telecommunication information sharing and analysis center? Do you think that's playing much of a role? Do you think it's being much used, or?
I think it's very helpful because what it does do is give visibility of a lot of these attacks. So there's a relatively small number of telcos who are really active on this. And there are some that are in fact publishing information every single day in terms of every single SS7 type attack that they're seeing. And so in a way, there's a little bit of shaming going on that you can go there and you can see, hey, attacks are coming out of this network or that network. And it's not something that you want to have it published that there's an attack originating from your network. So we try and block all attacks that are originating from our network. And if one does slip through, which does happen occasionally, we'll try and contact the other telco. We'll try and understand exactly how this happened so we can go back then and fine tune our firewall rules to prevent this happening in the future. And again, I think if there's more visibility and more peer pressure on those networks where this is originating from, it can only help. So kudos to those who are participating in the ISec and actively publishing this. And it's a shout out to all of the firewall vendors to say, make it easier to have this information directly published from your firewall platform into the ISec. that will certainly help this whole process. We work with Cellusys as our partner in this space, and we have them actively working on a mechanism to automate this publishing of information. And so hopefully when we do that, there's a handful of key players in this space that'll make a big difference again. And each one of these things helps in terms of cleaning up this environment.
Okay, so it might not be great to see that you've appeared in lights as a guilty party, if you like, but I guess it's much better to know than not.
For sure. Although some people may not want to know, and they may not want others to know, because if they're making revenue out of it and they can't afford to lose that revenue, they are the ones who are probably not going to sign up and probably then don't want others to know that this is happening. But peer pressure can only help us.
I think so. And that kind of brings me to my next question. So, Justin, are there particular areas of the world and IPXs, interconnection hubs, that are especially vulnerable? And do you view it as primarily being about poor regulation or weak regulation, or maybe desperate need for revenue? Or
look, I think regulation would certainly help, because with the GSMA Code of Conduct, it's voluntary to sign up for it. So that's going to take time to get everybody, and you might still get some who just never sign up, and you're going to have non-members and the like. If one had regulation, I think that would help. If I look globally, I see the European telcos having taken this seriously and for a number of years have been doing so. The US has been a little bit strange. In the early days, before we had all of our firewalls deployed, we would occasionally get messages through third parties saying that there were attacks originating from our networks against US companies, and there were kind of threats of saying, well, if these attacks don't stop, then they might consider cutting you off, and your users wouldn't be able to call people in the US and wouldn't be part of this global network.
oh.
But there was no talk of them deploying the firewalls to block it on their side. It was more a threat of saying, you need to stop this, as opposed to them saying, we're going to deploy the technology to prevent it. So it would seem that in the US, they haven't deployed it as widely as they should. I think there's been some talk recently again about the government having a look at this. I think the FCC is looking at it and has given a mandate to the telcos to come back and explain to them how they're tackling this issue and what they're doing about it. So maybe that will have some impact. If we look elsewhere, I think in the Asia Pacific region, we see quite a lot of attacks originating from small telcos in that space, but very few originating out of Europe.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, what about 5G, which we kind of touched on this earlier. So unlike 3G and 4G, it doesn't use the IMSI as the user network identity. But yet we still are relying on the same underlying principles and functions. So did we miss a trick there with 5G not to kind of bake this in better?
I think to some degree it has been baked in a little bit better with the security edge protection proxy. So the SEP should help around that. But again, not everybody's necessarily deploying it or deploying it early on. And that'll only really come fully into play when we have cloud native kind of 5G deployments. So the kind of standalone 5G deployments as opposed to the non-standalone. So while we're in a transition phase, you're still going to have some challenges. It's also hard to predict what vulnerabilities may be found in these new protocols and technologies over time. But I think that there's been a lot of learning from past mistakes. There've been a lot of attempts to bake these things into some of the protocols. And as long as it's deployed correctly, that'll be fine. Challenge here is that these older protocols are still used for many, many years. So while there's a desire to turn off things like 2G and 3G, they're still in wide use. And without government support, even those could take another 5-10 years before those are turned off. Then you still got to get 4G out of the ecosystem. So when we're talking 5G and the full benefits of that, maybe we're talking about the next generation, kind of 15 years time before the full benefits of that can be realized.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would think it's going to be a lot more than a decade. And finally, because I'm sorry to say we're getting close to the end of our session, I'm just thinking, aside from the sterling work done by the GSMA and other standards and trades bodies, what do you think needs to happen to overcome this problem of insecure signaling at interconnection points? I mean, is more regulation the answer, or is better technology and automation? I don't know.
Combination of both. I think, I'm not normally one who promotes regulation. I don't think it's always necessarily a good thing. But in this case, I think regulation would definitely help.
Mhm.
From a customer awareness and demand point of view, I think it would be extremely difficult for individual customers in a personal capacity to really create enough of a kind of groundswell demand to do anything. But if large enterprise customers started asking these questions of their telcos in terms of what are you doing to protect us, and writing that into RFPs for any kind of large contracts, if enough of that happened, it could create a groundswell of demand that would force telcos then to deploy these firewalls in place. And I think that would definitely help. But yeah,
That's
beyond that,
quite interesting, because I was talking to a large international carrier recently. He was saying about how regulators are increasingly interested not just in where data is stored, but what happens to it when it's in motion, and where if it has to be rerouted because of a fault, for example, where it goes and is involved. So maybe that might be an area that pressure could be applied from too.
Yeah, I think regulators have become a lot more interested over the last few years. And I think data sovereignty and data protection has certainly driven a lot of that, and that's now flowing into other areas. So yeah, often it's different regulators that are looking after the one area versus the other, but where they're engaging and talking to each other and looking at how can there be kind of cross-pollination and benefits, that can only help all of us.
Okay, Justin, that was really great. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you so much. We hope to see you again in the not too distant future. Bye bye for
Thanks.
now, though.